Good afternoon, Happy New Year, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. My name is Paul Harris, and I'm president of the City Club's Board of Directors. I'm pleased to introduce today's panelists to my right, Representative William Batchelder, Speaker of the Ohio House of Representatives, and Representative Armond Budish, Minority Leader of the Ohio House of Representatives. Two of the significant issues that have dominated our nation's political landscape are partisanship and massive budget deficits at multiple levels of government. Some might suggest that not to be a very good combination, and even more so given other challenges we face, such as addressing education and health care issues, which are two topics that we've recently heard addressed at the City Club. On the subject of state budget deficits, a November 5, 2010 economic update by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities stated that, and I'm quoting now, in the 2009 and 2010 fiscal years, the imbalance between available revenues and what was needed for services opened up budget gaps in most states. In addition, states have now addressed significant budget shortfalls in enacting their 2011 budgets, and even more budget gaps are projected for fiscal year 2012. Since the start of the recession, states have closed over $425 billion in budget shortfalls. Sizable budget gaps are likely to continue for the next several years, end of quote. So budget problems are not going away even as the economy rebounds. Today we have two distinguished Ohio representatives who are in a position to help lead the effort to address budget deficits and other complex challenges facing the state of Ohio. Representative Batchelder, a Republican from the 69th House District, assumed the House Speaker position on January 3rd of this year. A graduate of Medina High School, Ohio Wesleyan University, and the Ohio State University College of Law, Representative Batchelder returned to the Ohio House in 2007 after having previously served in the House for over 30 years. His district includes portions of Medina County. Representative Budish, a Democrat from the 8th House District, was selected last year by his party as House Minority Leader after previously serving as House Speaker. Representative Budish graduated with honors from Swarthmore College and received his law degree from the New York University Law School with Order of the Coif recognition. Now, for those of you who are not lawyers, that basically means he was a really smart law student. His district includes parts of the city of Cleveland and its eastern suburbs. I am also very pleased to introduce our moderator for today's panel, John Begala, who has had a multifaceted career as a leader in public policy, specializing in health and social services. Mr. Begala is Executive Director of the Center for Community Solutions, which provides research, nonpartisan policy analysis, and advocacy with the goal of improving the health, social, and economic conditions for Ohioans. He is also a Senior Fellow at the Urban Center at Cleveland State University's Maxine Goodman Levin College of Urban Affairs. John, I will now turn the program over to you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome everybody, and especially I'd like to welcome and salute both of the people who are to my left. We were joking before we got in here. It's real nice to see, to you, he's on the right, but to see Bill Batchelder over on my left is really a new experience for me. The Center for Community Solutions, along with the City Clubs, sponsored a similar event to this 2 years ago with the same two speakers. Their hats have changed and their offices have changed in the last couple of months. But the issues are very much the same, only bigger. The big issue 2 years ago was what were we going to do to balance the budget with a bipartisan General Assembly, a Democratic governor. Today, the Republicans control virtually every part of state government, including both houses of the General Assembly, but the budget hole that they face in the months ahead is deeper yet. We'll have hard numbers sometime in the not-too-distant future, but for now, we are one of several organizations that have tried to do some analysis to project how big of a structural deficit does the state of Ohio have. A number of you have a chance, or have a chance at least to peruse a document that we put out the middle part of last year called Thinking the Unthinkable, which looks at the revenue situation, the spending situation in Ohio, and then looks at what options are out there. There are many other groups who've done the same thing. Hats off to the 8 major chambers of commerce in Ohio who collaborated on a report that was released toward the end of last year. And the Ohio CPA Association, who's been very active in trying to promote bipartisan solutions, very much along the lines of today's topic, which is bipartisanship in the budget. We're going to, in the way of the organization of the program today, have about 5 to 8 minutes of initial comments from both Speaker Batchelder and Minority Leader Budish. We're then going to take a few questions that I'm going to pose to them just to warm things up a little bit, but not too much. And then the last half hour or so we'll be opening this up for your questions and comments, so please be prepared and think up some good ones. I think we're going to start with Speaker Batchelder.
Thank you very much, John. It's always good to be before you here. I was trying to think this morning how many times I had done this, and it's always much more frightening than floor debate to be here with all of you. Some people here don't agree with me. I've noticed that. I was Ronald Reagan's steering committee chairman, 1976-1980, just to give you an idea. The House Senate face very serious problems, as I'm sure this group is aware. We have a deficit situation in this state which is going to challenge our ability to meet the needs of people and at the same time try to avoid any kind of increase in fees or taxes or anything else. So that's the situation that we face at this point in time. This is not unprecedented. I was in the House from 68 until 98, and in that period of time we faced these kinds of problems several occasions. Never, ever with this severity. I have to go back to 37 to find this severity, and that was the year, as you may, I guess nobody here would recall that, but me probably. Yeah, well, that was
your first term,
my
wasn't
first term. It was. That's right. I was in the suburbs of downtown Cleveland. I think Brooklyn, perhaps at that time. The difficulty that we faced very clearly, and the difficulty we faced then, was that the concomitant of the difficulty is that there are many people who are in serious need, serious difficulties of life, frankly. And when that comes together with the lack of jobs, the whole thing is very, very threatening to people. And I think a lot of people feel that threatening atmosphere now. I have no idea at this point in time what the budget will look like. People say to me, well, what are you going to do? And then they name some particular and specific area. We don't know, because the governor obviously is not in a position to give us a budget. The governor brings the budget to the General Assembly, and we then work on it to help him. Isn't that the right phrase?
Sounds good.
To help him out. So that's down the road a ways, but it's going to be a very difficult session. I am blessed. I have 2 people on the Finance Committee who have served as chairman of the Finance Committee at one time and another, and those 2 members are going to be very much in the leadership as to what goes on in this area. Ron Amstutz of Worcester and John Kerry from down in the southeast part of the state. They have done this, but not in this atmosphere before. Those hearings will be extensive and intensive. There will be a period of time when they will, for 4 weeks in all likelihood, perhaps only 3, be meeting 5 days a week, and they will be meeting on Monday and Friday in the evening and through the daytime. We will have to have a very good picture of what we anticipate in the future, and we don't have that picture, obviously, and no one does. We can't get it from anyone. So that's something that we will try to derive information about as we go forward. We also want to do everything that we can to create jobs in the, if you will, in the real base part of what the budget is going to do. And that, I think, is a crucial element, particularly for us in Northeast Ohio. This area and Cincinnati at one time were the largest and most important parts of machine tooling and the metalwork in the country and in the world. And it was a place to which people came from Slovakia, from the works there at Bratislava, all over the world. People came here to work in the metalworking areas. That's something that we have to try to revive, and that'll be part of the educational picture that's going to be in the budget. But this is a time that is very trying for people, and it's a time that we want to make certain that we do the very, very best that we can. As soon as the governor's budget comes in, those hearings will start immediately, and hopefully we will have good coverage so that people across the state will know what the situation is and what the hope for improvements will be.
Oh, okay.
John Begala was a colleague of mine in the House, and he's used to my more 35-minute speeches than he is.
Shall I
All
start?
right, go ahead.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. If I've learned one thing in my fairly brief political career, it's this. Don't forget to introduce your family. And that's because the consequences can be really bad. So let me first introduce my son Daniel and my wife Amy, who are here at the front table. No one in public service can do their job without the support of their family. And Amy, Daniel, I thank you very much. Almost as important is introducing your colleagues in the House. And I see two here. I see Representative Davila and I see Representative Kathleen Clyde. If I'm missing anybody who's in the House, let me know. I also see other elected officials that I only get 8 minutes, so I'm not going to introduce you. It's also great, again, to have the opportunity to share a forum with my friend, Speaker Bill Batchelder. And now that he's the Speaker, it's especially good to have him here so that I can keep my eye on him. When asked to speak today, we were given two potential topics, the lack of bipartisanship and the Ohio budget, and we have 8 minutes or so. So I let Bill take the easier one, the budget, and I took bipartisanship. We live in a very diverse state. The North is different from the South. Rural areas differ from suburban areas differ from urban. We're varied by race, religion, gender, lifestyle, politics. The state legislature reflects this diversity, and that's a wonderful plus. Bipartisanship is the way we make our diversity into our strength. Take people of different backgrounds and experiences, put them together, meld their ideas, and come up with better, stronger solutions to problems. Ideally, bipartisanship creates better legislation. What makes it so difficult to create a bipartisan environment? One word: power. The struggle for power is the enemy of bipartisanship. When you're out to defeat your colleagues in order to gain control and power, it's harder to work with them, harder to credit them, harder to build them up. There are a number of specific factors that contribute to the difficulty in reaching bipartisanship in Ohio, and I'll highlight just 3 of them. First is term limits. State legislators can serve no more than 8 years, with a few exceptions. Bipartisanship is strengthened by personal relationships and trust between members. And there's no substitute for time when it comes to building those relationships. Second is the 2-year term. In the Ohio House, members are always running, campaigning. There's no opportunity to simply serve as a statesman. 2-year terms are too short to foster bipartisanship. Third is the prevalence of non-competitive districts. The apportionment process in Ohio is controlled entirely by partisan politics. The majority party has the ability and the incentive to draw district boundaries to create as many safe, non-competitive districts as possible. When you're elected from a non-competitive district, your only possible competition tends to be in a primary from someone at the more extreme end of your party, Democrat or Republican. Competitive districts drive members to the center. Non-competitive districts drive members to the extremes. And extremists have a harder time reaching bipartisan solutions. So what can we do to create a more bipartisan environment? I'll offer a few suggestions. One is to eliminate or at least extend term limits, perhaps from 8 to 12 or 14 years. Two is to extend the terms of office of House members from 2 years to some longer period. Three is to adopt reapportionment and redistricting reform to remove partisan politics from the process and to maximize the number of competitive districts. For more than a year, I worked with the League of Women Voters, Republican Senator, now Secretary of State John Husted, and others to reach a strong bipartisan plan. We almost got there, but not quite. Partisan politics undermined our efforts in the end. To move forward, we will need active citizen participation to achieve any and all of the solutions I mentioned. And let me cite a few specific initiatives which we have already undertaken in the House and which I believe have been successful. The House Clerk's Office runs much of the day-to-day work of the House, and it had previously been used as a place to place political appointees. When I took control of the House 2 years ago, I decided to try to take partisan politics out of the clerk's office and to make it more bipartisan. I created a new rule that would have a clerk and a deputy clerk who would be of different parties. I'm thrilled to say that that experiment has worked very well, and it's my understanding that Speaker Batchelder intends to continue the clerk-deputy clerk arrangement. Second, I appointed a Democratic member and a Republican member to serve as social chairs and to arrange a series of bipartisan social events for House members. We have to try different things to build personal relationships in these times of term limits. And when you bowl with someone, it's a little harder to fight with them the next day. I would declare this to a success. Third is the use of joint primary sponsors on bills. For this, let me give you a little background. The primary sponsor of a bill is the person who creates and works the bill. The bill belongs to the primary sponsor and bears his or her name. Historically, there had only been permitted by House rules one primary sponsor of a bill, and that fosters extreme partisanship. For 14 of the last 16 years, Republicans have controlled both the Ohio House and Ohio Senate. The only gap was the last 2 years. When I first arrived at the House for orientation in 2006, I listened to a presentation by Minority Leader C.J. Prentice. Now, if you know C.J., and many of you do, she's full of energy and she is not shy. I was stunned when she announced that over her 16 years in the state legislature, despite having introduced and worked on many, many bills, she had not been allowed to have a single one of her bills passed. And she was the minority leader who has a little bit of juice. It turns out almost no bills with Democrats as lead sponsors were allowed to pass. Oh, maybe there was a road naming bill, something like that, but not substantive bills. This goes back to my beginning remarks. Power is the enemy of bipartisanship. Republicans did not want to pass Democratic bills for fear of making Democrats more relevant. It's a lot easier to run against a Democrat when the opponent can argue that the Democrat never passed a significant bill. Well, thankfully, all that changed 4 years ago when House Republicans created a new rule to allow a Republican and a Democratic member to create a bill together and to serve as joint primary sponsors with both names on the bill. In my view, nothing did more to foster bipartisanship than this. So when I became Speaker, I continued this practice. Now, no one was forced to find a joint sponsor or joint primary sponsor for a bill. A member could still choose to have his or her own bill. But over time, this rule encouraged and encourages more and more Democrats and Republicans to work together on legislative efforts. Over the last 2 years, more than 20% of all bills passed by the House had joint Democrat and Republican primary sponsors. I go through this detail because I have to say I was surprised to see that the House sent a memo yesterday to all members stating that we will not be having joint sponsors of legislation this General Assembly. Since that was the first that I had heard of this policy change, I have not had a chance yet to discuss it with Speaker Batchelder. But I'll look forward to having further conversations with him over the next few days. I hope that I'll be able to convince him to continue the joint sponsor policy. 2 years ago, a wise man said, and I'm quoting, "We can, we must, and we will work together to move Ohio forward regardless of our party, our backgrounds, and our regions." Those words, spoken by now Speaker Batchelder, are just as true today as they were 2 years ago. I and the Democratic caucus are eager to work with you, Speaker Batchelder, and the Republican caucus. The economic and social problems that Ohio faces require bipartisan consideration and bipartisan solutions so that we can help all of the people of Ohio, regardless of their diverse background. Thank you.
Well, let's begin with a question about term limits and about reapportionment and redistricting coming up. And you can both respond to this as you see fit. How, given that nothing was enacted that changes the process and that we are about to go through, are there opportunities, given the current rules of the game, to have more competitive districts and a more competitive biennial election for General Assembly seats over the next few years? Or is this going to be pretty much business as usual as it has been the last 50 years or so?
Well, it's longer than that, but not that I was there. I think that we are going to see a differentiated approach to it, but that's only from talking with the members of the apportionment board. Ultimately, they really make those decisions.
I think it's very difficult to do anything but business as usual, given the current rules that are in place. I hope that I'm wrong, but I think that's the case, especially since the Constitution currently requires certain rules to be followed that enhance the likelihood of gerrymandered and non-competitive districts. In particular, I'm referring to what's been called the county rule that's in the Constitution. But when you have one party that draws the lines, it's natural that party will want to enhance their opportunities to win in the future. In the future. So we were very close. I had worked on reapportionment at great length. I had actually reached agreement with Senator Houston on a compromise plan. The House had passed a version, which I thought was much better than the Senate's version, but nonetheless, we passed a version with bipartisan support out of the House. The Senate passed their own version. Senator Houston and I had multiple meetings. We came to an agreement, but unfortunately, partisan politics, especially, I'll attribute it to the Senate, made it impossible to pass something. And I'm hopeful that maybe there'll be a citizen movement to put something on the ballot to change the way apportionment's done. But unless that happens, I don't see a change.
Well, maybe there'd be another way. You've got this as a constitutional issue. You've also have a whole number of tax issues that are embedded in constitutional problems in Ohio. One opportunity that Mike Curtin wrote about in the Dispatch a couple months ago was Constitutional Revision Commission. There was one back in the 70s, and that is get a real bipartisan group that can look at the whole series of things affecting things like the DeRolf decision, reapportionment, and other issues, and see if there's not some way to address a number of these things at a time, including perhaps term limits, extending them, for example, to 12 or 14 years.
The Constitution of the state of Ohio, as a result of the Constitutional Convention in 1912, has as one of its requirements the submission to the voters of either a Constitutional Convention program or the rejection of that, and then in between, what Representative Begala is talking about, which is an approach that would submit certain changes to the voters in lieu of a constitutional convention. That was a interesting time in Ohio's history. That was the time of the progressives, the first round of progressives anyway, and they were in a position to dominate that convention. And so, in effect, people were told, you have a shot every 20 years at changing the process. My sense would be that that will be what will happen. I was committed to that in '72. I think it's an important thing for us to do. That is, have issues submitted individually on the ballot. What those are, I don't know at this point, obviously, but that was done at that time, and I think the results were good. I think
There are 12.5 amendments passed back in the 70s, I think, something
That's
like
right.
that.
Yeah, we had a citizen committee to do it, as opposed to the legislature. But
Does the General Assembly have to create that?
yes, we do. And my sense, since I got back, frankly, and realized how close we were to a constitutional conventions can be mischievous, to put it charitably. So if you submit things through a citizen gathering, similar to a constitutional convention, I think you can end up with probably a better result than either having the legislature submit a whole bunch of amendments or a constitutional convention do that.
And you'd agree with Representative Budish about term limits ought to be on the table for that?
Well, I would agree with it, but I'm the poster child for term limits after 35 years, and I managed to, steer around it by way of the Court of Appeals. But I think that that is something that has to be taken up. Armond is exactly right. There's an alienation among the members because we don't have those long-term. John, you and I have talked on the phone and so forth ever since you left in the 80s?
Yeah, I think that's right.
You can't recall when you left. You build those relationships over time, and you have those relationships the rest of your life if you're somebody who enjoys politics and also policy.
Let me ask one budget question before we do this little break here. One of the kind of shifting gears, but this also has its constitutional piece of that. For years, people on the right have said Ohio is a high-tax state.
Right.
For years, people on the left have said Ohio is a low-tax state. And they both have data that prove this.
Yes.
In the course of researching our book last year, we looked at it and said, well, actually, everybody's right on this. If you look at just state taxes, we're pretty low.
That's
If you look at state and local taxes combined, we're pretty high. We were surprised, I was surprised, to discover that Ohio is one of only 4 states that authorizes municipal income taxes,
Correct.
for example. And most people don't know that. They also don't know that corporations pay Ohio municipal income taxes. And when you look at that together with state corporate taxes, which is what the business community often looks at, you end up with a very different picture than you might have, say, from the other side of the aisle. So how do you look at local government, state and local taxation together going into this 8, now maybe as much as $10 billion deficit position over the course of the next 2 years? You have to look at it not only long term, but also you got to get the money out next year.
Right.
It's got to start.
Right. You put your finger on one of the products of the home rule language in the Constitution from the 1912 Constitutional Convention. I don't think anybody had ever thought about having an income tax for cities at the time of the convention, but the power that was given to local cities in that language permitted them to, in Toledo first in 1946 or 7, start with an income tax. It went to the Ohio Supreme Court, and they said, yeah, that's inherent in the home rule language. And so Ohio is in a very different position. In addition to that, we had a great political statesman in Ohio for 4 terms as governor, who anytime people wanted to have their own local tax, he was in favor of it. No state taxes, just local taxes. Let the local people put it on the ballot, and he originated 5 of them right in the legislature, sent them back, and of course today we have a number of taxes, local sales tax, and these other things that are embodied in some of those ideas. And Jim Rhodes didn't get blamed for any of them because they were all done locally. We obviously have to visit that area. We have less state control over the state budget than any other area because of this, of the home rule provisions that allow, even encourage local government, county, state, local government to undertake the passage of these taxes. So it's good to come up. There's no question about it. I think when it does come up, there will be a great concern on the part of most local governments.
Armond, you want to?
I'm concerned that we may see this current administration taking a page out of former Governor Rhodes' book. We're hearing about cutting the local government fund. We're hearing about cutting some of the subsidies on property taxes. We're hearing about eliminating the estate tax, all of which fall directly on the local governments. We could be talking about hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars stripped from our local governments overnight. That would be a disaster. What it would do is it would exacerbate the problem you're talking about, John, by saying to the local governments, you've got to raise more money, or else you're going to have to cut police and fire. I mean, that's a horrible position for cities to be in. Mayor Posick from Bedford's here, he's shaking his head. You can't put cities in that position. Now, the state, as with Governor Rhodes, wouldn't get blamed necessarily because they're not raising taxes, but you can't put the local governments in a position where they have to raise taxes or slash fire, police, and other necessary services.
John, may I reply to something that Armond said having to do with this business of dual sponsorship? In 1995, when Republicans took control of the House of Representatives for the first time in 22 years, Joanne Davidson was Speaker, I was Speaker pro tem. We passed 17 bills in the first 6 months sponsored by Democrats. They were the primary sponsors of those bills. That will be the case again. I'm not going to hold bills up because of the sponsor. And I don't know how that worked after I left for the Court of Appeals, but I know that it's the first 2 terms we moved a bunch of Democrat bills. And it seems to me that that's important.
Yeah. Do we need to take an announcement here?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are listening to a special Friday forum featuring Ohio House Speaker Bill Batchelder and Ohio House Minority Leader Armond Budish. We'll return to our speakers momentarily for our traditional City Club questions, so please start formulating your questions now, and we would ask you to keep them brief and to the point. We remind you that members and guests alike are welcome to attend City Club forums and hope that everyone listening to us will join the City Club and become active in our ongoing civic dialogue. Please visit our website, www.cityclub.org, to see a full schedule of our upcoming programs. We welcome all of you here and those listening to WCPN 90.3 FM, WCLV, WTAM, or one of the many radio stations across the country. Our television broadcast partner is WVIZ PBS IdeaStream. The television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by generous support from Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. We welcome guests today at tables hosted by Baker and Hostetler, Consolidated Graphics, Cuyahoga Community College, Greater Cleveland Partnership, Kent State University, PNC, and Sisters of Charity. Thank you all for your support. Now we would like to return to our speakers for the traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphones today are City Club Membership and Marketing Manager Heather Sikora and Program Director Carrie Miller. First question, please.
Good afternoon.
Oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Shakira Diaz. Over the last 20 years, our sentencing laws have made people criminals who were not criminals 20 years ago. Consequently, we have a growing number of people who are either unemployable or very difficult to employ. Cuyahoga County alone has a returning population of about 10,000 people who cannot get a job. And 60% of those people who are incarcerated in our state prisons are low-level nonviolent offenders. We understand that there are some conversations about how to house these people. Where do we stand in terms of sentencing reform that would keep people out of the criminal justice system and deal with them effectively cost effectively in a more productive manner that doesn't label them unemployable or difficult to employ for life?
There's legislation pending in both houses. I'd worked with a gentleman who became a judge and went back to Cincinnati in the House side. There is a senator also from Cincinnati who has been working on it on the Senate side. That would basically keep people who are a year or less, and maybe in some cases even more than that, out of the prison system. And the reason for that simply is that it does, as you say, characterize them in a way that it really is not commensurate with their activity, and therefore it damages them for perhaps lifetime, but in any case in the short term. The other side of that is that we cannot afford to keep the prisons operating the way that they are. Many people who are sentenced to a year don't actually get to the prison for 6 or 8 months. And this is a pretty much of a waste. By the time they're categorized, perhaps assigned work to do in the prison or education that they should take, by the time that happens, they're already in a situation where they're getting ready to leave the facility. So we have to do more in terms of local effort to monitor people, whether electronically or whatever. But this area is one that's going to get very quick focus. I was very fortunate that I had a former colleague of mine on the Court of Appeals who was willing to run, in his retirement, willing to run for the House, and he will chair the Criminal Justice Committee. And he and I used to talk together in conference room about what in the heck was this guy doing in the penitentiary, given what he had done. So it's something, and I know that Armond has also been involved in working on this and negotiating. Obviously, we don't want to have people who have a pattern of physical violence outside of the facility on the street. Equally, obviously, it doesn't make much sense to have people in without that background who might be through a, whether it's a electronic bracelet monitor, whatever it might be, who's capable of being rehabilitated from what had been a minor offense.
This is an area that I think House Republicans, House Democrats can probably reach agreement on fairly quickly. We did commission a lengthy and in-depth study over the last year, which was done by the Council of State Governments. They have done similar studies in other states, which has, in those states, led to very productive legal changes.
Just to follow up on that briefly, if you assume that the 12 to 15,000 people a year that go into Ohio's prisons that have sentences of less than 1 year were pulled out of the pipeline 2 years down the road, say, will the General Assembly be open to the idea of closing prisons? And what would be the process of doing that, recognizing the difficult home base issues that creates for members?
I don't think there's any question but that as a matter of economy, we would close prisons. I understand that some members will have to vote against that due to the fact that the prison's in their district.
Right. I think we have one right here.
Is there any hope for a change in the term limit section, or is it hopeless, and if so, why?
I can respond to that because for some reason I was focused on it after 35 years, and I think we can do something about it. Unfortunately, it's an idea that polls well, but I've talked to leaders of labor unions in particular. They think it's crazy. Gordon Gee, I've discussed the matter with him. He's president of the Ohio State University. He has shown a willingness to coordinate the higher educational community and work with them to try to get the thing fixed. The problem is, very frankly, that the general public has the idea that somehow or another this keeps you from getting bad legislators. And I simply would say to them, look at the previous county government in Cuyahoga, and you know, we really need to fix this thing. And I want it fixed because what we have today is a situation in which just as people become experts, they leave. And I don't know any business in the state that has a policy that once you learn what you're doing, we fire you. the public has the right to fire people. This thing is almost drafted as if the sub-thought is, let's keep me from voting again for that idiot.
We had been working on this for a while again, and we had a little bit of pushback from Republicans last year. But now that Republicans have taken, not this Republican, by the way, but now that we have seen the Republicans take over the whole state government, we may get a different response. So.
Bill, what do we do?
It really will take, I think, you have to go to the Constitution and you have to have a very vigorous support program for a constitutional ballot initiative. There's been talk about having nonpartisan leaders or bipartisan leaders lead it. Speaker Batchelder mentioned Gordon Gee. There's been mention of people like Joanne Davidson and John Glenn and others who might be willing to lead an effort like that. But it's going to take people in this room and elsewhere to get behind something like that.
One back here.
Thank you. As I sit here, I'm trying to remember how long I've known each of you, and I think my first recollection of the Budish family is about 1980 when my son dated your sister for a while, and with Representative Batchelder since we started law school together in 1964. So it's nice to see both of you here. I serve on the board of the Menora Park Center for Senior Living, which is comprised of a series of facilities which provide community services and residential options to support the wide-ranging needs to our population during the aging process. And we employ about 1,400 people to do that. Our skilled nursing care residence, the largest in Ohio, is recognized as a quality provider with a national 5-star Medicare/Medicaid rating. Given the fact that 3/4 of our patients are on Medicaid, and it's costing us approximately $75 a day more to take care of those patients than is provided by Medicaid, and given the grim outlook of the state budget, the question is, how can we work together to solve this problem?
We, over the last, in the last budget, well, I'll even take a step back further. When I first came to the legislature, one of my reasons to come was long-term care issues. As some of you know, I've worked with those issues for my adult career. I am very passionate and concerned about families facing issues dealing with long-term care. And I prepared legislation, joint sponsored legislation with a Republican chairman of the Health Committee that would have allowed, encouraged, and incentivized more and more people to be able to stay home or in community-based programs rather than nursing homes and still receive some Medicaid support. We believed and still believe that the costs would be significantly reduced overall. It would also allow people to stay where they want to stay, which is at home or in the community. However, we also need to make sure that we continue to maintain adequate support in nursing homes, for nursing homes, because when you start moving more people into home and community-based care, you're leaving the nursing homes with the sickest and the people who need the most care. So as a result, I actually fashioned legislation which would have moved more people into community service and still supported the needs of the nursing homes with no additional funding, by the way. And it was supported and endorsed by the groups for the home-based caregivers, for the assisted living facilities, and the nursing homes. And the AAA, and the Alzheimer's Association, and others. We were not able to get that passed at that time 4 years ago, but the governor, Strickland, created a unified long-term care task force. They came up with a variety of recommendations which paralleled the legislation we had worked on, A number of those pieces were put into place in separate legislation over the last 3 years, 4 years, 3 years ago, 2 years ago, and in House Bill 1, the budget last cycle, we put in a whole lot more. We are now seeing the fruits of some of that coming forward as we speak. A Medicaid waiver was just granted for assisted living and for home and community for home care. And I'm optimistic that we'll see, as a result of those efforts, more funding being shifted to home and community-based care, but still protecting the nursing homes, because we have to make sure that the nursing homes can provide adequate care for people who need to be there.
Among the things in the last budget to help finance Medicaid, on which we benefited from enhanced federal match for the last 2 years, which is going away, is that the General Assembly increased the bed tax on nursing homes and enacted fees on hospitals that raised significant revenue. The hospital part sunsets the end of this biennium. What do you think the prospects are for those two sources of revenue? And if they go by the wayside, what happens to the deficit numbers?
Very frankly, I think that we have to seek more waivers from the federal government so that we're in a better position to fund the adequacy of these various facilities. I spent time the other day with Senator Rob Portman. He asked me what I thought we needed to have from them, and I said, get your foot off our neck, but we have to apply for that. That means a governor has to undertake the effort to get that change. I think one of the changes that ought to be allowed, Shirley, is where families would like to help a relative, but they cannot pay the cost of Medicaid, the cost of keeping someone in a nursing home in its entirety. And there ought to be their ability to provide some assistance without getting into either or, which is the situation now. I think that we are going to be looking at those issues. I have two very strong members in our caucus, and I know Armond has as well, who are very interested in Medicaid. And so I think we're going to have a session where there'll be a lot of focus on that. I couldn't predict what the outcome will be.
Armond?
We took a strong stand on, I'll mention the hospital fees that you mentioned, not taxes, fees. The hospitals we know here in Northeast Ohio are critical. Critical for care for people, also critical for jobs and employment. The spin-offs from the hospitals, the strong healthcare community we have here are critical. So I spent a lot of time with the Hospital Association during the budget. We came up with a way to, especially since I know a little bit about Medicaid, we were able to come up with a way to generate more federal funds. That reduced the hole that the hospitals were facing by more than $150 million. And then when the increased FMAP money came through just months ago, the governor and I talked, and the governor agreed administratively to make up the rest of that difference with the additional FMAP. So ultimately, the hospitals suffered no loss in the last budget, and the added fee was simply designed ultimately to pull down more federal money. I think that the next budget has to look at doing something similar. We will need more federal funds, more federal assistance to help balance this huge hole, and the FMAP is one thing that can be utilized. But we have to protect the hospitals and the nursing homes.
Well, thank you for bringing up the issues of support services for people who are in need while you're struggling with the state budget coming up. As you know, 1 in 4 of our citizens suffer from either mental illness or substance abuse, and the treatment for the mental health and substance abuse has already had state budget cuts of 30%. And now more of a shift of funding is being required at the local county level. There's a lot of concern that Medicaid, the match required for Medicaid, is now having to come from counties, and that can happen in our county and be very devastating to having any services at all available for people who are uninsured. And yet we know what's good for society and for the individuals is to have treatment available when they can use that. What are your plans for addressing mental health and substance abuse funding, particularly given the revenue side of the budget being supposedly off limits? How can we keep from having more of these costs shifted to the local level or no services at all available?
Very frankly, that is something about which I have had concern, but in a different way. There's been an effort to raise the focus of state assistance to the state level. I don't think that's very good. I think different counties have different problems. I would like to see us restore those funds in the sense of not cutting down the size of that bureaucracy and so forth. I am not sure where we're going to be in terms of the federal aid and some of these other issues. We don't have a budget in front of us at this point, and I think it's going to be, I've met with the governor Tuesday, I think it's going to be a very difficult matter. On the other hand, he's very aware of the need.
One thing, again, I want to come back to the, because we talk about nursing homes, for example. I just want to clarify, I don't think of it as nursing homes. I think of it as the patients and the families, and those are the people who suffer if the funding is not sufficient. And it's the same thing with mental health. We're talking about, it's easy to talk about budget, and it's easy to talk about numbers, and it's very cold, and it doesn't deal with the flesh and blood realities. We cannot cut mental health services anymore. We have cut to the bone, and we need a commitment from our governor and our legislative leaders that they will find the money for mental health services and for health care for the poor. We cannot continue to cut. We cut in the last budget $2 billion. That is real money, and those were real cuts, and they were the first cuts, I will say, in actual budget spending in decades by the legislature. You hear a lot about talk. This was the first time we made real cuts. And you can't think of it as budget cuts. These are people cuts, and these are necessary service cuts. And to talk about cutting more is irresponsible.
Point one thing. One of the dilemmas in this, when you talk, Mr. Speaker, about the bringing the match for the Medicaid up to the state level for mental health services, the failure to do that is resulting in things like this happening, that it is in the financial interest of local boards to fill vacant nursing home beds, which is on the state's nickel for the matching dollars rather than the county. Right. And we've got a lot of people under age 65, many of them pretty highly functional, who are housed in nursing homes to the tune of $6,000 a month, that could be supported in the community for a fraction of that. And that's the dilemma I think that they're talking about, is we're really in the mire on this one. There's no easy way out of it.
I agree. That's a great concern.
One over here.
Hi, good afternoon. We've seen this enormous growth in technology that permeates every aspect of our lives, and yet most of our privacy laws were written back in the 70s and 80s before any of this technology was even contemplated. Would you agree that it's time for Ohio to update our privacy laws to take into account the technologies that permeate our lives?
I'm probably the most challenged member of the House in terms of technology. I make them take that machine out of my office for fear that it's listening to me or something. I think we do have some very knowledgeable people in the legislature on that area, and I think I've talked to the Senate on a number of occasions. We've not really had good joint House Senate committees. This is an area that has to have extensive hearings. It has to have all kinds of people involved, from the Civil Liberties Union to those who manufacture these things and so forth. So it strikes me that at this point we face a challenge, and I think it has to be answered with that kind of research and work. It's something I would hate to see just a plain bill put in.
You know, we had two university presidents here. Dr. Lefton was here earlier, and Dr. Proenza is here too. Any thoughts on higher education as we look forward the next 2 years as far as the budget's concerned?
I'll take a stab. Over the years prior to Governor Strickland coming into office, the legislature cut funding to higher education over and over again, forcing 9% per year tuition increases at our colleges and universities every year. It made college and university unaffordable for many of our kids. We were hearing stories about them going out of state because they could pay less. Yeah. That we can't have. So Governor Strickland came in, he provided more funds for higher education, froze tuition completely. We came in, even in a horrible budget where we cut $2 billion, we provided enough funding that we could cap tuition increases at 3.5% compared to states like California that were raising their tuitions 30%. We have to maintain funding adequately for higher education. Again, it's an area where we can't cut or we lose our most precious resource, our kids.
You've got the last word. I think we're getting the big high sign over here as far as the program is concerned.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we have been listening to Ohio House Speaker Bill Batchelder and Ohio House Minority Leader Armond Budish. Thank you, representatives, for your very informative remarks. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.